Story 1. The Nameless Pharaoh. The storm had raged for hours, throwing the research vessel, Orpheus, like a child's toy on the blackened Atlantic waves. Dr. Elias Monroe gripped the rusted railing as lightning illuminated the churning abyss below. He had dedicated his life to the pursuit of lost civilizations, and now, with an ancient map clenched in his trembling hand, he was closer than ever to the greatest discovery of all, Atlantis. For years, skeptics had ridiculed him, dismissed his theories as fantasy. But Monroe had found something hidden beneath layers of myth and deception. The map, recovered from the forbidden archives of the Vatican, depicted an island that had vanished over 12,000 years ago. The symbols scrawled across the parchment were unlike any known language, but Monroe had deciphered enough to understand its significance. It wasn't just a city lost beneath the waves, it was a vault of knowledge, a relic of an age more advanced than modern civilization dared to imagine. A deafening crack split the sky, and a colossal wave smashed against the ship. Monroe stumbled, his fingers tightening around the map as crew members shouted over the howling wind. He turned to his colleague, Dr. Catherine Langford, an expert in ancient languages. "We're close," Monroe shouted over the storm. "If the coordinates hold, we'll reach the anomaly before dawn." Catherine's emerald eyes were filled with both excitement and fear. "And if it's not just a myth?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Then history will never be the same." By morning, the ocean had calmed, revealing an unnatural stillness in the waters below. The sonar scans showed something impossible, a massive structure 3 miles beneath the surface, symmetrical, impossibly preserved. The shape suggested something not built by nature, but by hands. The crew prepared the submersible, a state-of-the-art deep-sea exploration craft known as Nautilus III. Monroe, Catherine, and their engineer, Raul Mendoza, descended into the abyss, the pressure of the deep causing the walls of the vessel to groan. At 8,000 feet, the ocean was a void, endless and silent. At 12,000 feet, the first signs of ruins appeared. Pillars covered in coral, statues staring through eons of darkness. And then, at 15,000 feet, they saw it. A city, vast and sprawling, with massive monolithic structures carved from a stone that shouldn't exist. Glyphs lined the walls, symbols unlike any language on Earth. But it was what stood at the heart of the ruin that stole Monroe's breath. A colossal obsidian temple. At its peak, a massive sphere pulsed with a dim golden light. It wasn't natural. It wasn't human. "What the hell is that?" Raul whispered. Monroe's voice was dry. "Something ancient." As they maneuvered closer, the submersible's systems flickered. Instruments failed. A deep resonating hum filled the water around them. Then, a voice, not through speakers, not through radio waves, but inside their minds. "You should not be here." Before they could react, an unseen force pulled the submersible forward, dragging them toward the temple's entrance. Catherine screamed as the Nautilus breached the barrier, a shimmering wall of energy that rippled like liquid glass. And then, silence. The ocean was gone. The crushing pressure vanished. They were inside. The submersible rested on solid ground, surrounded by a cavern so vast it defied reason. Faint, ethereal lights floated in the air, illuminating what could only be described as an ancient control room. Massive panels lined the walls, engraved with constellations that did not match Earth's night sky. At the center of the room, a pedestal held an object, a golden codex, glowing with an otherworldly aura. Monroe stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached for it. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, the visions began. A civilization of impossible grandeur. Towers of metal and crystal, machines that defied physics. A people, tall, luminous beings with eyes like burning stars. They had ruled the earth once, long before the first human carved stone into tools. And then, a cataclysm, a war. Not against humans, but against something far older, something that still waited. The vision shattered. Monroe collapsed, gasping. The codex pulsed in his grip, its energy seeping into his skin. "Elias!" Catherine's voice was distant. "What happened?" He looked up, his mind racing. "We were wrong," he whispered. "Atlantis didn't fall. It was sealed." A low growl echoed through the chamber. The air trembled. Shadows slithered across the walls, coalescing into figures. Tall, inhuman, with eyes like smoldering coals. Guardians. They had been waiting. As Monroe rose to his feet, the leader stepped forward, its voice a whisper of eternity. "You have unlocked the first key, but knowledge comes at a price." The chamber shook. The ancient machinery awoke. The countdown had begun, and far above, on the surface, the ocean churned. Something was rising. The ground beneath them trembled, and the air thickened with an electric charge. Monroe could feel it pulsing in his bones, an unseen force coiling through the ruins like a serpent awakening from a long slumber. The Guardians, those towering inhuman figures, remained motionless, their eyes burning like dying stars. Raul cursed under his breath, gripping the submersible's control panel. "We need to get out of here now." Catherine clutched Monroe's arm. "Elias, what do they mean by the first key?" Monroe's thoughts raced, still reeling from the vision that had torn through his mind. The Atlanteans hadn't just vanished. They had sealed themselves away. Sealed something away. And now, by taking the codex, he had set something into motion. The Guardian standing before him tilted its head, as though studying him. Its voice was neither spoken nor heard, but instead pressed itself directly into his thoughts. The vault was never meant to be opened. The entire chamber shook. Behind the Guardians, a set of massive doors, black stone veined with glowing shifting symbols, groaned as if resisting some invisible pressure. From beyond them, something stirred, something old. Monroe took a step back. "The vault. It's behind that door, isn't it?" The Guardian's eyes flared. "Leave this place. Take nothing." But Monroe couldn't. He knew, deep in his gut, that whatever knowledge lay in Atlantis was not meant to be buried. Humanity had forgotten too much. "No." The Guardians did not react at first. Then, the one standing closest to him raised a skeletal, elongated hand. The air around it shimmered, and Monroe felt his entire body seize as an unseen force lifted him off the ground. His lungs compressed. The pressure in his skull built like 1,000 knives pressing inward. He could hear Catherine screaming his name. Raul lunged forward, trying to wrench Monroe free, but he might as well have been trying to move a mountain. Just as Monroe felt his vision darken, the codex in his hand pulsed. A brilliant golden light flared from its surface, and suddenly, the force dropped him. He hit the ground hard, gasping for air. The Guardians recoiled, their forms flickering like smoke in a high wind. "What the hell just happened?" Raul shouted. Monroe struggled to his feet, his fingers still wrapped around the codex. They can't touch me while I have this." Catherine pulled him back. "Then let's go before they figure out a way." The entire ruin groaned. The massive black doors behind the Guardians were starting to crack. From the other side, a sound reverberated. Not a voice, but a presence. A feeling of infinite hunger. Monroe didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, Catherine and Raul right behind him. The moment they crossed the threshold of the chamber, the shimmering energy barrier that had allowed them inside collapsed. The cavern shook violently. Ancient stone gave way, and something deep beneath them let out a low, resonating growl. They sprinted toward the submersible. Monroe dove into the cockpit, slamming his fists onto the controls. The engine hummed to life, but the energy fluctuations around them were wild, unstable. Raul gritted his teeth. "The systems are fried. That energy field did something to our..." A violent shockwave and exploded outward from the vault. For a fraction of a second, Monroe saw something through the fissures in the black stone doors. Our massive, shifting form. Neither solid nor liquid, neither beast nor god. Something that was waking up. He didn't have time to think. The submersible lurched upward, breaking free of the collapsing ruins. Through the viewport, Monroe saw the city of Atlantis fading into the darkness below. The vault doors were wide open. Something was coming out. The Nautilus 3 breached the ocean's surface just as the storm returned. Waves slammed against the side of the Orpheus as the crew scrambled to pull the submersible on board. Monroe collapsed onto the deck, chest heaving. Catherine and Raul emerged moments later, drenched in seawater and sweat. The ship's captain, a grizzled old sailor named Vasquez, stormed toward them. "What the hell happened down there? Our instruments went haywire. Pressure spikes, seismic activity." Monroe barely heard him. He turned toward the horizon. The ocean was shifting. Not like waves, but like something was moving beneath the surface. Catherine followed his gaze. "Elias, tell me we didn't just make a mistake." Monroe opened his palm. The codex was still there, warm against his skin. He could feel something in it now. Something alive. "The Guardians weren't protecting the vault," he murmured. "They were keeping something inside." Raul shivered. "And now?" Monroe swallowed hard. "Now, it's loose." Thousands of miles away, deep beneath the Vatican, a single candle burned in a windowless chamber lined with ancient tomes. A man in dark robes stood over an altar, staring at a set of freshly translated documents. The words were scrawled in an impossible language, one older than any human civilization, but the translation had been clear. "The first key has been taken. The seal is broken. The hunger will rise again." The robed man closed his eyes. He reached into his cloak and pulled out a small, ornate device, something both metallic and alive. Pressing it to his temple, he whispered a single phrase in a language that had not been spoken aloud for millennia. The device pulsed. Across the world, others like him turned their heads skyward. The time had come. Monroe and his team returned to the United States in secrecy. The Orpheus had been detained by international authorities, citing safety violations and unauthorized deep-sea exploration. The codex was hidden. The world above remained oblivious. But Monroe knew the truth. He could feel it, like an itch in his mind. In the days following their return, reports flooded the news. Oceanic anomalies, strange disappearances, mysterious seismic tremors. And then, the first sighting. A fishing trawler off the coast of Portugal vanished without a trace. Only a single garbled radio transmission remained. A voice, trembling with fear, repeating the same phrase over and over. "It is awake. It is awake. It is awake." Monroe stood at his office window, staring into the night. The codex pulsed in his grip, whispering in a voice only he could hear. Atlantis had not been a city. It had been a prison. And he had just opened the door. Monroe barely slept in the days following their return. He felt as though something unseen lurked at the edges of his reality, just beyond the veil of perception. At night, he would wake in a cold sweat, the codex glowing faintly on his bedside table. The whispers were growing stronger. Catherine was the first to notice. "You're not eating," she said, standing in the doorway of his cramped apartment. Rain lashed against the windows, casting streaks of silver light across the cluttered desk where Monroe had spread out his notes. "I'm fine," he muttered, flipping through a page covered in rough sketches of the symbols they had found in Atlantis. Catherine stepped forward, lowering her voice. "Elias, you haven't been fine since we left that place." He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. He knew she was right. Something had changed inside him. He could still feel the codex, more than just its presence. It was as if it were embedded in his very being, resonating with something vast and incomprehensible. "Have you seen the news?" she asked, He didn't need to ask what she meant. Reports were surfacing every day, freak storms in the Atlantic, strange lights beneath the ocean. The disappearances of entire ships. Scientists were baffled, fishermen refused to leave the shores. And then there were the sightings. Blurry satellite images showed impossible structures rising from the seabed. Deep-sea sonar scans returned readings that didn't make sense, moving, shifting patterns that implied something alive. And there were the voices. Radio transmissions picked up across the Atlantic carried whispers in an unknown language. Some had dismissed them as interference, but Monroe recognized the cadence. It was the same language the Guardians had spoken. Catherine hesitated before speaking again. I did some digging. That symbol, the one etched onto the vault doors, we've seen it before. Monroe looked up. She pulled a file from her bag and spread it out on the desk. The Vatican archives. This was taken in 1943. Nazi expedition into the Mediterranean off the coast of Santorini. Monroe's breath caught in his throat. The black and white photograph showed a stone fragment, partially buried in the sand. The carvings were unmistakable, the same veined glyphs that had marked the vault. What happened to it? He asked. Catherine hesitated. The artifact was confiscated after the war. It was taken to the Vatican's secret archives. Monroe's stomach twisted. And where is it now? Catherine exhaled. That's the thing. It was stolen. When? 3 days ago. A chill crept through Monroe's spine. Someone else knew. Someone else was looking for answers, and they weren't the only ones. The codex trembled in his hand. The whispers grew louder. Thousands of miles away, in a darkened chamber beneath the Vatican, a group of figures gathered around a circular stone altar. The air hummed with unseen energy. Candles flickered, casting elongated shadows against the ancient walls. The leader, a man cloaked in black robes, placed the stolen artifact onto the altar. The glyphs on its surface pulsed with a dull, rhythmic light. We are too late, he murmured. His voice carried the weight of centuries. The seal has already been broken. The others remained silent. He reached into his robe and withdrew a small vial filled with an iridescent, golden liquid. With slow precision, he poured a single drop onto the stone. The reaction was immediate. The glyphs blazed to life, golden light seeping into the cracks of the altar. The chamber trembled. And then, the whispers. They came from nowhere and everywhere at once. A language that had not been spoken in 12,000 years filled the air. The robed figures did not flinch. They had been waiting for this. The hunger stirs, one of them whispered. The leader pressed his hand to the stone. His eyes turned an unnatural shade of black. It has already begun. Monroe and Catherine arrived in Rome under false names. The Vatican archives were heavily restricted, but Monroe had an old contact, Father Michael Serrano, a historian with access to the library's forbidden sections. Michael met them in a dimly lit corridor beneath St. Peter's Basilica. This is madness, he whispered, leading them down a spiraling stone staircase. You shouldn't have come here. We don't have a choice, Monroe said. Something is waking up, Michael. We need to know what it is. Michael hesitated before unlocking a heavy iron door. Beyond it lay a vault of ancient texts, manuscripts older than Christianity itself. He pulled out a dusty, leather-bound volume. This is what you're looking for. Monroe flipped through the brittle pages, his eyes widening at the detailed illustrations. The vault, the same obsidian doors they had seen in Atlantis, the same glyphs, the same warning. And then he saw it, a creature emerging from the depths of the ocean. Formless, shifting, vast. A single word had been scrawled beneath it in Latin. Devourer. Monroe translated aloud, the Devourer. A silence settled over the room. Catherine exhaled. That's what was locked away. Michael's face was pale. The scriptures say the Atlanteans sealed it beneath the sea, locked it away before it could consume the world. Monroe clenched his fists, and now it's free. Michael turned to him, his voice a whisper. Then there is no time left. Far beneath the Atlantic, something stirred in the darkness. It had been dreaming for millennia, suspended in the void between sleep and wakefulness, waiting. But now, the chains were broken. The first seal had been shattered when Monroe took the Codex. The second, when the stolen artifact was activated beneath the Vatican. The third, the ocean trembled. All across the Atlantic, strange lights flickered beneath the waves. Coastal villages fell silent overnight. Fishermen disappeared without a trace. And then, the first ship was found. Drifting off the coast of Gibraltar, an oil tanker with a crew of 73. The vessel was intact, no sign of a struggle. But it was empty. No bodies, no signs of life. Just a single, massive symbol scorched into the steel of the deck. The same glyph that had been on the vault doors. The hunger had returned, and this time, there would be no one to stop it. Monroe stood in the Vatican archive, his breath slow and controlled, though his heart pounded with unease. The ancient manuscript lay open before him, its brittle pages covered in inked warnings from a civilization that had been forgotten long before human history had truly begun. Devourer, the Devourer, the hunger. The words carried an unfathomable weight, as if the mere act of reading them aloud could summon whatever force they described. Catherine sat beside him, flipping through another volume filled with cryptic diagrams of an ancient celestial alignment, one that had last occurred over 12,000 years ago. She stopped, her eyes darkening. "Elias," she whispered, "look at this." He leaned in. The diagram depicted the same vault they had discovered in Atlantis. But this time, it wasn't one closed. It was open. At the center of the image, a great black shape twisted upward, rising from the depths. Below the image, a passage had been scrawled in a dialect of ancient Greek. Catherine translated aloud. "When the 3 keys are taken, the gates will break. The hunger will rise, as it did before, and the world will tremble before it once more." Monroe's stomach twisted. 3 keys. His fingers brushed the sword. Codex scarce still clutched in his hands. The first key, the artifact stolen from the Vatican. The second key, and the third? Michael exhaled sharply. "There was a third artifact," he admitted. "But it was lost centuries ago." Catherine's eyes snapped to him. "Lost where?" Michael hesitated. "A temple, deep in the Amazon." A chill passed through the room. Monroe's mind raced. If they had any chance of stopping what had begun, they needed to find that key before, and someone else did. Before it was too late. 3 days later, Monroe, Catherine, and Raul were deep in the Amazon jungle, cutting their way through the thick undergrowth. Rain fell in sheets, drenching their expedition gear. The heat was oppressive, the air thick with the buzzing of unseen insects. "This place is ancient," Catherine murmured, stepping carefully over the roots of a massive ceiba tree. "Older than anything recorded in history." Raul adjusted his pack. "Then let's hope it's still standing." They followed the coordinates, ones that Monroe had found buried within the pages of the Codex. The numbers had been imprinted into his mind, as though they had always been there, waiting for him to discover them. By nightfall, they reached it. The temple stood half buried in the jungle, covered in creeping vines and the weight of forgotten centuries. But there was no mistaking what it was. Massive obsidian walls jutted from the earth, covered in glyphs identical to those found in Atlantis. This was no Mayan ruin, no Incan fortress. This was something older, something Atlantean. Raul ran a hand over one of the carvings. "I don't like this." Monroe ignored him, pressing forward. A tread. Massive stone doorway loomed ahead, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to shift in the dim moonlight. Catherine swallowed. "Elias, are you sure we should—" The codex shuddered in Monroe's grip. The doors began to open. A gust of cold air rushed from the darkness beyond. Monroe took a step forward, barely aware of the others. He could hear something calling to him, whispering, singing. The temple wanted him inside. He entered. The interior was massive, far larger than the exterior should have allowed. The architecture was impossible. Walls curving in ways that defied geometry, corridors stretching into unseen darkness. They moved cautiously, their flashlights casting long shadows over the ancient walls. Then they saw it. The third key. It rested upon a pedestal in the heart of the temple, a crystalline artifact humming with an eerie blue glow. Catherine stepped forward. "This is it." Monroe felt a deep unease settle into his chest. The codex pulsed in his hand, reacting to the presence of the artifact. Something wasn't right. Raul gripped his rifle. "Let's take it and get out." Monroe hesitated. He reached for the artifact, and then the ground split open. The walls screamed. The air rippled. Something was coming. Far across the world, in the depths of the Atlantic, the ocean convulsed. The waters churned violently, spiraling downward into a great abyss. The last of the vault's seals shattered. Something rose. It had been dreaming for too long, and now it was awake. The temple trembled around them, the walls vibrating as if they were alive. Monroe staggered backward as an unseen force rippled through the air. The artifact. The third key glowed brighter, pulsing in sync with the codex still clutched in his hand. Then the whispers returned. But this time, they were not distant echoes. They were here. Catherine gasped, pressing her hands to her ears. "Elias, do you hear that?" Monroe didn't answer. The whispers weren't just sounds. They were thoughts pressing into his mind, foreign and impossible. "Take it. Free us. We hunger." He reached for the artifact. A blast of force erupted from the pedestal, knocking him backward. The temple groaned, cracks spiderwebbing through the black stone as something shifted beneath them. Raul grabbed Monroe by the collar. "We have to go. Now." But Monroe was barely listening. The codex burned on in his grip, its golden light seeping into his skin. The third key was not a key at all. It was a lock, and he had just broken it. Far across the world, the Atlantic churned as a shape broke the surface, about a monolith, blacker than night, rising from the depths, like a severed limb of some colossal buried entity. The ocean screamed around it, waves crashing in unnatural spirals. Ships vanished. Entire coastlines pulled into the abyss. The sky above darkened, as if the very heavens recoiled from what had been released. And then, the voice. Not a sound, but a vibration that shook the earth itself. "We have waited long enough." The jungle split apart as Monroe, Catherine, and Raul sprinted out of the collapsing temple. Massive tendrils of black stone erupted from the ground, twisting and writhing toward the sky. The air hummed with an unnatural pressure, like reality itself was being pulled apart at the seams. Raul fired a shot at one of the tendrils. The bullet vanished before impact, as if consumed by the air itself. "Run!" Monroe shouted. They barely made it to the clearing before the temple exploded, sending shards of obsidian and ancient dust into the air. Silence followed. Monroe lay on his back, his breath ragged. The codex lay beside him, glowing dimly. Catherine coughed, rolling onto her side. Tell me we didn't just do something incredibly stupid. Monroe didn't answer. He was staring at the sky. The stars had changed. In London, deep beneath the British Museum, alarms blared as ancient relics reacted to an unseen force. Symbols that had remained dormant for millennia now pulsed with an eerie glow. In Washington, D.C., satellites captured disturbances across the Atlantic, anomalies so vast they defied measurement. And in the Vatican, the robed figures knelt in silence, their faces turned toward the sea. "The Devourer stirs," one of them whispered. The leader, his eyes completely black, pressed his palm to the cold stone floor. "No," he murmured. "It is already awake." Miles beneath the ocean, something moved. Something vast. Something that had waited for eons in the silence. The final seal had been broken, and now the world would remember. The sky above the Amazon was wrong. Monroe lay motionless, staring up at the heavens. The constellations had shifted, subtle at first, but undeniable. He had spent years navigating by the stars, and now they were misaligned, as if the Earth itself had been tilted by an unseen force. Catherine sat up beside him, rubbing her arms. "Do you feel that?" He did. The air was heavier, charged with something neither heat nor humidity could explain. The jungle was silent, not just absent of birds or insects, but an awed, absolute stillness, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Raul stumbled to his feet, gripping his rifle. His voice was tight. "We need to go." Monroe barely heard him. His gaze drifted to the codex, still glowing faintly in the dim moonlight. The artifact they had taken from the temple, the so-called third key, had shattered in the explosion, leaving only fine dust where it had once rested. That dust was Ida floating, now shimmering like embers caught in a breeze. Then, from deep within the jungle, up a low, resonating hum. Not a sound, not an animal, but a frequency. A vibration that crawled through their bones. Then the ground began to shake. Half a world away, in the control room of an orbital space station, an engineer stared at his monitor in frozen disbelief. "Commander," he croaked, you're going to want to see this." The station's sensors, designed to track deep-sea currents and geothermal anomalies, were picking up something impossible. In the middle of the Atlantic, near the location of the fabled, sunken continent of Atlantis, a structure was rising from the ocean floor. It was larger than any known city, a sprawling mass of black stone and spiraling towers, emerging from the abyss like a wound in the earth. But that wasn't the worst part, because the water around it was sinking, not receding, not being pushed away. It was being devoured, vanishing into a chasm that had not been there before. The Atlantic Ocean itself was collapsing inward. In the Amazon, Monroe and his team ran. The jungle around them split apart, trees toppling, as something huge moved beneath the surface. The very landscape shifted, like a pulse rippling through the skin of the earth itself. They reached their camp just as the first shockwave hit, a force so immense it sent them crashing to the ground. The sky fractured, a brief, terrifying ripple that revealed something behind reality, something vast and formless. Then the whispers came again. But this time they were no longer whispers. They were a voice. "You have awakened us." The words didn't come through sound. They bypassed the ears completely, pressing into their skulls like a tide rushing inward. Monroe clutched his head, his pulse pounding. He couldn't think. He couldn't move. "You have opened the door," Raul screamed. Catherine's breath came in short gasps, her hands digging into the dirt. Then, Silence. The pressure vanished. Monroe looked up. The jungle was gone. Or rather, it was still there, but different. The trees looked older, their shapes slightly wrong, as if they had been replaced by something that only vaguely understood what trees should look like. The colors were off, too vibrant, too alive, as though the world had been painted by an unfamiliar hand. And the sky, the stars, were still shifting. Monroe forced himself to stand. What the hell just happened? Catherine was shaking. Elias, we're not in the same place anymore. Raul checked his compass. The needle was spinning wildly, unable to find north. They hadn't just triggered something. They had moved. At that same moment, in a military base deep beneath the Pentagon, General Marcus Slade stood in a darkened war room, watching a satellite feed of the Atlantic anomaly. He had seen many things in his years serving classified operations. Unexplained crashes, ancient artifacts buried in places they shouldn't have been, technology centuries ahead of its time. But nothing like this. The Atlantic Ocean was changing. Ships had disappeared. Entire coastal cities were experiencing blackouts, their power grids failing as an unknown energy field spread outward from the rising structure. And then there were the reports. Survivors rescued from ghost ships, fishermen who had seen things in the deep, massive moving shadows too large to be whales, too fast to be tectonic activity. And then, the radio transmission. A garbled voice from a freighter off the coast of Portugal, barely understandable through static. It's not an island. It's breathing. And then, nothing. Slade turned to his lead scientist, Dr. Aisha Novak. What are we looking at? Novak hesitated, her hands shaking as she typed commands into the terminal. General, she whispered, this isn't just an earthquake or a tectonic shift. She turned to face him, her expression drained of color. It's a reawakening. Slade's jaw clenched. Of what? Novak took a long, shuddering breath. Of whatever the hell they locked away down there. Beneath the Atlantic, the Devourer stirred. It was no longer confined to sleep. It had been patient. It had watched as ages passed, as new civilizations rose and fell, as the fragile creatures of the surface forgotten the terror that once ruled their world. But now, the keys were broken, the doors were open, and it was hungry. The ocean groaned as its shape unfurled, casting a shadow upon the deepest trenches of the earth. Above, in the skies over the Atlantic, the clouds spiraled outward in an unnatural pattern, forming a perfect circle. A storm with no eye, only an abyss. A new era was beginning. And this time, the world would not survive it. Monroe barely recognized the jungle around them. Everything looked the same, but wrong. The trees had shifted, their shapes unfamiliar, their bark pulsing, as though alive. The air smelled different. The sky churned with unfamiliar stars. We moved, Catherine whispered. Elias, I don't think we're in the same time anymore. Monroe turned sharply. What? She gestured to the codex, which no longer glowed. The artifact had led them here, but now it was inert. Raul exhaled, checking his gear. His compass was still spinning, unable to settle. I don't care where we are. We just need to get out. But Monroe wasn't sure that was possible. Then the hum returned. It came from everywhere at once, vibrating through the ground. Monroe felt it in his ribs, like standing too close to a jet engine. Then, a voice. Not whispers anymore. A voice so vast, so deep, it seemed to come from the very fabric of reality itself. You cannot run. Raul screamed as the jungle ripped apart. Black tendrils erupted from the earth, twisting and writhing like the veins bursting from the ground. They weren't solid. They weren't anything. They existed on the edge of perception, shifting between forms faster than the mind could comprehend. Monroe grabbed Catherine's hand and ran. The jungle blurred around them. Trees became shadows. The ground twisted beneath their feet. Reality itself was unraveling. Somewhere behind them, Raul fired his rifle. The gunshot sounded wrong, like echoes in an empty space. Then, a scream. Monroe turned, just in time to see Raul vanish. One of the tendrils touched him, and in an instant, he was gone. No blood, no body, just erased. Catherine choked back a sob. Monroe didn't let her stop. They ran. Deep beneath the Atlantic, the Devourer continued to rise. Its form was indescribable, not because it could not be seen, but because it should not be seen. Its body was shifting, ancient, outside the bounds of what the human mind could process. It was not one creature. It was many. And it had waited for so long. It did not rage. It did not hunger like a beast. It simply was. And soon, so too would be the rest of the world. At NASA's Deep Space Observation Lab, alarms blared as the stars shifted, not just in the sky. Every recorded star chart in human history was now incorrect. "Sir, this isn't possible," one technician stammered. "We're getting conflicting data across every observatory. The constellations are wrong." General Slade stood over the display, his face grim. "Define wrong." The lead scientist, Dr. Novak, turned. Her eyes were wide, her skin pale. "They've moved, and not by light years." She swallowed hard. "The entire cosmos has rearranged itself." Slade's blood ran cold. "That's not possible." "It shouldn't be," Novak whispered. "But something is rewriting the very fabric of our universe." She pulled up another display, one showing a deep-sea scan of the Atlantic anomaly. "General, I think we're not just dealing with something ancient." She hesitated. "I think we're dealing with something older than time itself." Monroe and Catherine reached the edge of the jungle, except it wasn't the jungle anymore. The landscape had changed. They were standing at the edge of an impossible city. Massive cyclopean towers jutted from the earth, built from black stone that hummed with unnatural energy. The structures were wrong, tilted at impossible angles, curving in ways that defied geometry. Catherine clutched Monroe's arm. "This isn't Earth," she whispered. "Not anymore." Monroe exhaled, staring up at the sky. The moon was gone. In its place, something vast loomed, an eye, burning with golden fire, staring down at them. Then the voice returned. "You have broken the seals. Now the world must be remade." Across the world, the seas churned. Tsunamis engulfed entire coastlines. Cities fell silent as the stars continued to move. Something was rewriting reality, and there was no stopping it. The city before them pulsed with an impossible presence. It was not ruins. It was alive. The buildings shifted as if they were breathing, their surfaces rippling like liquid obsidian. Massive glyphs crawled across the walls, symbols that should have been static, but were constantly rewriting themselves. Catherine clutched Monroe's arm. "This place..." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Elias, I don't think it's just ancient." Monroe exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around the codex. "It's not. The city wasn't from the past. It was from a lifetime that should never have been." and it was returning. Beneath them, the rock earth trembled. Far away, a horn sounded, a sound so deep, so vast, that it seemed to vibrate through the very fabric of existence. Then, the sky cracked open. At NASA headquarters, the room was in chaos. "We're losing satellites," a technician shouted. General Slade watched as the fawn feed from space dive flickered, then vanished. One by one, every orbital telescope, every probe, every device that had been watching the stars went dark. Dr. Novak clutched her headset. "We just lost contact with the ISS." Slade's voice was tight. "Tell me what's happening." Novak turned, her face pale. "Sir, space is collapsing." Slade stared at her. "Explain." She swallowed hard. "Our instruments no longer detect anything. No planets, no galaxies, just..." She hesitated. "The void." Slade's heart pounded. "You're telling me the universe is just gone?" Novak's voice was barely a whisper. "No, I'm saying something else is replacing it." Monroe and Catherine stood frozen as the sky burned. Above them, the stars warped, twisting into spirals of golden flame. The constellations shifted like living things, forming symbols that had no human meaning. Then, the city moved. The towers unfolded, twisting and rearranging themselves into new shapes, as if reality itself was being rewritten. Catherine took a shaky breath. "Elias, we have to..." Then the voice returned. It did not speak in words. It spoke in burnt truths. "You have broken the order. The old world must be unmade." Monroe fell to his knees as her visions flooded his mind. Not images, not memories, but rewritten possibilities. The world resetting, the oceans boiling away, the lands shifting, reshaping, becoming something new. Reality itself, folding, unraveling, twisting into something else. And at the center of it all, the Devourer, a being without form, a presence, older than time. It had no shape because it had never needed one. It had existed before the concept of matter had ever been spoken into existence, and now it was here. Monroe screamed. Across the world, the unraveling accelerated. In Tokyo, the concrete skyscrapers stretched upward, twisting into impossible angles, becoming spires of black stone. In Cairo, the pyramids cracked, revealing new structures. Beneath them, older than history, built for something that was now returning. In New York, the oceans withdrew, revealing colossal stairways leading downward into a void where the sea should have been. And in the Vatican, the robed figures knelt in silence, watching as their shadows no longer matched their bodies. One of them whispered, his voice trembling, "It is no longer the world we knew." The leader turned, his eyes completely gold. "No." His voice was filled with something ancient. "It is becoming the world it was always meant to be." Monroe staggered to his feet, the codex in his hand, burned. It was no longer an artifact. It was a map. A Gurran guide to the new order, and he could still feel it. This wasn't just an apocalypse. It was a replacement. Everything they had ever known was being rewritten into a shape that had existed before history, before mankind, before time itself. Catherine gripped his wrist, shaking him. "Elias, listen to me. If we don't do something, there won't be anything left." Monroe met her eyes. He had seen the visions, and he knew. It was already too late. Far beneath the Atlantic, the Bersun Devourer rose. It had no shape. It had no form. It now was. The ocean folded around it, the very concept of your water and space warping in its presence. It mind stretched, it now expanded, and it now opened its eyes. Eyes that had watched civilizations rise and fall, eyes that had seen the birth of stars and the death of gods, and as it gazed upon the world once more, it spoke, not with sound, not with words, but with reality itself. And the world bent in response. Monroe knew what came next. The Mo Codex had told him. This wasn't their first time. This had happened sure before, and it would happen sure again, because this was how the world truly worked. Civilization was never meant to last. Humanity was never meant to rule. They were just the latest attempt. And now, the Devourer was here to begin again. The sky shattered. The oceans rose. And the world was consumed. The world was breaking apart. Monroe stood at the edge of the impossible city, staring into the sky that was no longer a sky. The stars had fully shifted, forming massive, spiraling glyphs of golden fire, ancient symbols that had no human translation. The Devourer was no longer just rising, it was rewriting. Across the horizon, the ocean was folding inward, collapsing into the vast voids of nothingness, revealing structures that had never been meant to be seen again. Massive, cyclopean towers of obsidian jutted from the depths, humming with a resonance that vibrated through the bones of the earth. And above it all, the Devourer watched. It was not a single entity. It was a presence, a force that had existed before existence itself. It did not rage, it did not hate, it simply was. And now it was undoing everything that had come after it. In Washington, D.C., General Slade stood in the underground war room, staring at the last remaining satellite feed. What he saw should not have been possible. The entire Atlantic Ocean was gone, not drained, not vaporized, simply gone. And in its place was something else, a landscape of shifting stone, colossal towers stretching into the sky, replacing reality itself. "We've lost Europe," one of his officers whispered. "Everything past the eastern seaboard is—" She didn't finish. The air shook. Then, a sound so vast, so deep, the walls of the Pentagon cracked. Not an explosion, not an impact. A word, a name, something that had never been spoken by human tongues, but something that had always been waiting. The Devourer had declared itself, and reality answered. Monroe fell to his knees. The set codex pulsed in his hands, its golden glow flickering, as if struggling to stay real. Catherine gripped his shoulder, her breath ragged. "There has to be a way to stop this." Monroe exhaled. "We were never meant to stop it." She shook her head. "Elias." "No, Catherine." He turned to her, his eyes filled with something more than fear. Something horrible. Understanding. The world was never supposed to last. He lifted the codex. The pages had not changed. The ancient script was no longer the same warnings, the same prophecies. It was now instructions. A one-eyed's guide, not on how to stop the Devourer, but on how to survive what came next. He looked up at Catherine, the knowledge burning into his mind. "This is the reset." She took a step back. "Elias, what are you saying?" He turned the codex toward her, his voice hollow. "This has happened before." Her face paled. "No." "Yes." Monroe stood, his breath shallow. Atlantis wasn't a civilization. He turned toward the Devourer, watching as the sky itself ripped apart, folding inward like fabric, revealing something older, deeper, beyond human comprehension. It was the last world. Catherine shook her head, backing away. Monroe took a slow breath, staring at the pages of the codex. There's a way through. He traced the ancient glyphs with his fingers, and a lower path, under a place that remains even after the rest is gone. That was what the Atlanteans had discovered, and that was why they had sealed the Devourer away, not to stop it, but to delay it, to give the next civilization a chance to escape, a chance to survive. Catherine trembled. Catherine. You're saying humanity was never meant to win? Monroe met her eyes. No. He turned to the crumbling city around them. We were just a trial run. Far above, in the heavens, the Devourer spoke again. Not in words, not in sound, but in absolute truth. And the world ceased to be. The last survivors stood at the threshold of the impossible. The codex had shown them the way. And as Monroe stepped forward, through the last remaining door into what lay beyond the end of the world, he knew the truth. This was not the end. This was only the beginning. Because somewhere, far beyond the ruins of this failed reality, the next world was waiting. The Devourer had consumed the earth. But something would come after. It always did, because this was the cycle, and it would never end. Monroe's last memory of your Earth was the sky breaking apart, the Devourer speaking reality into oblivion. Then, silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of everything. No air, no sky, no weight. Just existence resetting. And then, he awoke. Monroe gasped, his lungs burning, as though he had been drowning. His body convulsed as he lurched forward, fingers clawing against rough, warm, and stone. He was alive. But where? He pushed himself up, blinking rapidly. The world around him was impossible. The sky was red, not like a sunset, but a deep, pulsing red, as if it were a living thing. Massive, crystalline spires jutted from the landscape, shimmering with an unnatural glow. The air hummed round with energy. This was not Earth, but it was something. Somewhere. A tool, place that existed beyond the end. Behind him, a groan. Monroe turned sharply. Catherine was there, coughing, struggling to rise from the ground. She was alive, too. Her eyes met his, wide and filled with 1,000 questions. Elias? Monroe swallowed. His mind was still catching up. He should be dead. The world had ended. And yet, the codex was still in his hand. He looked down. The pages had unchanged. The words were different now. No longer a prophecy, no longer a warning. Now, it was Gagamap. A guide to whatever this place was. The new world. Catherine took a shaky breath. Where are we? Monroe exhaled, his fingers tightening around the codex. I think, he murmured, looking at the alien horizon. We're in the next cycle. Somewhere beyond the red sky. Something watched. The sorted Devourer was gone, but something else had taken its place. Something older. Something waiting, and the cycle was about to begin again. This was not the end. This was just the next civilization, the next experiment. And this time, it would be different, wouldn't it? Monroe took a slow breath, staring out at the alien landscape before him. The world stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast expanse of twisting stone formations and towering crystalline spires that hummed with an energy he couldn't name. The sky above them was not blue, but deep crimson, pulsing like the embers of a dying fire. Nothing about this place felt right. And yet, he was alive. Catherine stood beside him, her breath shaky. This isn't Earth. Monroe swallowed hard. No. The Sec Codex in his hand still pulsed with warmth, the pages rewritten in a language that felt familiar, despite being utterly impossible. It was a map, not of Earth, but of this place. They moved carefully across the foreign terrain, their steps echoing against the massive rock formations. The air felt thick, with an unseen presence, as though something unseen was watching, waiting. And then, a structure. It loomed in the distance. A massive, spiraling tower made of a substance that seemed neither stone nor metal. It shifted, twisting subtly, as though it was both solid and alive. Catherine's voice was hushed. That thing is on the map. Monroe nodded. The Chao Codex had led them here. But why? Deep beneath the shifting red sky, something stirred. It was not the Devourer. That entity had done its part, had reset the cycle. But this place, this world, it belonged to something else. And it had been waiting for them. They reached the tower. It was even larger up close, its walls carved with symbols older than anything they had ever seen. The air around it felt charged. Monroe ran his fingers along the glowing inscriptions. The moment he touched them, his mind exploded. Visions. A city, not of Earth, but of this place. A people, tall, robed figures with golden eyes, moving through streets paved with living stone. They had built this. They had lived here. They had known. And then, utter great collapse. Not an invasion, not a war. Something else. Something that had been waiting in the void beyond cycles. Something that had not been erased when the last world fell. Something that was still here. Watching, waiting, hungry. Monroe staggered back, gasping. Catherine caught him. "What did you see?" He stared at her, the truth burning behind his eyes. This isn't the first time. Her expression tightened. "What?" He turned toward the tower, his hands trembling. This place, these people, they were the civilization before Atlantis. Catherine froze. Monroe's nature swallowed hard. This is where the last survivors of the previous cycle ended up. He turned back to the inscriptions, running his fingers over the ancient glyphs. And I think they left us a warning. Catherine's voice was barely a whisper. About what? Monroe exhaled. About what comes after the Devourer. The sky rippled. Somewhere in the distance, a sound rumbled through the land. Not thunder, not wind. Something else. Something coming. Far beyond their sight, deep beneath the surface of this new world. Something began to wake. It had been waiting, watching, and now the cycle had begun again. And it was hungry. Monroe's breath wasn't slow, controlled. The last time he had felt this way was when he stood before the vault of Atlantis, realizing he had unleashed something that was never meant to return. But this was different. The Codex had changed. Before, it had guided him to Atlantis. It had shown him the seals, the prophecy, the cycle. Now, it was leading him somewhere else, to something else. Catherine ran her fingers along the glyphs on the spiraling tower, her face twisted in deep concentration. These symbols, they tell a story. Monroe looked at her. What kind of story? She swallowed. One that was never supposed to be told. Deep beneath the surface of this new world, something shifted. It had no name. The Atlanteans had tried to name it, but language had failed them. They had entrapped it, but time had eroded their prison, And now, it was watching again, waiting, because the new cycle had begun. And with it, a new prey. Catherine traced the carvings with trembling fingers. Elias, these symbols talk about the Devourer. They knew about it. Monroe nodded. Makes sense. If this was the world before Atlantis, then... She cut him off, her voice tight. No, you don't understand. She stepped back from the wall, turning to face him. The Devourer wasn't the real threat. Monroe stilled. His mind reeled. What? Catherine gestured to the symbols. Look, it says the Devourer. Or Set, you were one the world. But it didn't do it on its own. It was controlled. Guided. She pointed to the final glyph, a wide spiral of eyes, surrounded by writhing tendrils. Something that had been watching the cycle from the very beginning. A force that was never erased, a force that was still here, waiting for them. Monroe's voice was dry. This isn't the end of the cycle. He turned to face the shifting city. It's a trap. The Bosch ground trembled. A distant sound echoed across the landscape, deep, resonating, inhuman. Something ancient had noticed them, and now it was coming. In the ruins of the last civilization, deep in the core of this broken world, something uncoiled. It had waited for this moment. The cycle was not about resetting. It was about feeding. And now there were new minds to consume. The Codex had led them here for a reason, because the cycle could not continue unless something was sacrificed. And this time, it would be them. Monroe grabbed Catherine's arm. We have to move. Now. She hesitated. But the Codex brought us here, he snapped. And I think I finally understand why. The map hadn't been guiding them to safety. It had been leading them to the altar. The sky darkened. A new storm gathered over the city, swirling it faster than any natural wind should. The spiraling towers began to shift, rearranging themselves into a new shape. No longer ruins, no longer a city, but a doorway. And something was stepping through. Monroe and Catherine ran. They didn't know where to go, only that they needed to get away from the spiraling horror unfolding behind them. But as they ran, the land changed beneath their feet. The crimson sky stretched downward, the landscape bending, turning into something that wasn't stone, wasn't metal. It was alive. The world itself was becoming something else. Catherine gasped, "Elias!" Monroe turned and saw it. A shape standing at the center of the shifting storm. It had too many eyes, too many arms, and it was smiling. Welcome to the next world. The Sauk's smiling thing stood in the distance, its too many eyes unblinking, its shape constantly shifting. It wasn't like the Devourer. The Devourer had been an end, a force that reset existence, ensuring the cycle continued. But this was something outside the cycle. Something that had been watching, something that had been waiting. And now it had unnoticed them. Monroe staggered backward. The landscape was still changing, the towers twisting, the sky bending into war-ass shapes that shouldn't exist. Catherine's voice was hoarse. "Elias, what is that?" Monroe swallowed, gripping the Codex. The symbols were still shifting, rewriting themselves faster than he could process. "I don't know," he whispered, "but I think..." His breath caught. The Codex had stopped changing. For the first time since Atlantis, since the world had ended, the symbols had unsettled. And now they formed a name A name older than the Devourer. A name that had never been spoken in any cycle before. A name that should never be spoken. The thing in the distance tilted its head. Then it sheared and spoke. You are not supposed to be here. Far beyond the ruins of this forgotten world, something moved. It was neither matter nor energy. It was neither alive nor dead. It was Gao, the observer. It had watched as countless civilizations rose and fell. It had watched as each world was wiped away and rebuilt. But never had something survived beyond the end, until now, until them. And that meant something had gone wrong. Monroe took a slow breath, forcing his mind to focus. The thing before them wasn't attacking. Not yet. It was waiting. Catherine's voice was shaking. Elias, do you feel that? He did. The pressure in the air. The way reality itself seemed to be questioning its own existence, like the universe was hesitating. The thing to your ass took a step forward, its many arms unfolded, its form stretching, unraveling into something vast. It was not bound by shape. It was not bound by time. And now, it wanted to understand why they were still here. You were supposed to end. Monroe's pulse pounded in his ears. The War Codex pulsed in his hands. The words shifted. One final time. And now, they formed a single sentence. Run. The sky collapsed. The towers unshattered, spiraling upward in a vortex of broken geometry. The world folded inward, warping into shapes that defied logic. The thing reached forward. Reality bent as in its grasp, and Monroe ran. He grabbed Catherine's hand, dragging her with him as the landscape around them dissolved. There was nowhere to go. This world was not a place. It was a question. And the thing that ruled it wanted answers. In the deepest part of this world, beyond the structures of the last civilization, beyond the remnants of what came before Atlantis, something ancient stirred. It was the final remnant. The last secret. A place beyond cycles, beyond resets, beyond gods. And Monroe was running straight toward it. The Codex knew the way, because it had been written for this moment. And the only way to escape was to find the thing older than the cycle itself. The one thing the observer feared. The true first civilization. The ones who had tried to break the cycle and had been erased. Behind them, the thing smiled. It did not chase them. It did not need to, because no one had ever escaped this place. And Monroe and Catherine would be no different, would they? They ran. The chakra world around them dissolved, shifting between our realities, rewriting itself as they moved. Monroe could feel it, the way the ground beneath him was changing, as if it had never truly existed in the first place. The thing behind them did not chase. It didn't have to. It was Yomar, the world. And it was watching. Catherine stumbled, nearly falling as the landscape twisted. Entire chunks of floating ruins, drifting past them like islands on an invisible sea. Monroe gritted his teeth, gripping the Codex tightly as it pulsed. It was leading them somewhere. Somewhere that still had existed outside the cycle. Somewhere the thing behind them feared. Deep beneath the shifting land, something awoke. Not a creature, not a god, a remnant. A fragment of the first civilization, the ones who had tried to now break free. They had been erased. Their world had been consumed, but something of them remained. And now, it had felt Monroe's presence, and it was waiting. Monroe and Catherine reached the edge of the world. Before them, a great chasm stretched into infinity. Beyond it, nothing. No sky, no land, no light. Just an absence. A void that had never been filled. The codex pulsed. Again, its symbols shifting. Monroe's breath caught. This isn't just a place. Catherine turned to him, eyes wide. Then what is it? He exhaled. It's where they hid. Far behind them, the Mayan thing smiled. It had not let them run, because it knew. There was no escape. There never had been. And soon, they would understand that too. Soon, they would see what happened to those who defied the cycle. Soon, they would know why nothing had ever truly survived beyond the end. Because the thing that had watched was not the worst of it. The worst had been waiting beyond the void. And now, it was waking up. Monroe stood at the edge of existence. The chasm before him was not just a void. It was an absence, a wound in reality, something that had never been filled. The codex trembled in his grip. It was guiding him forward, beyond the edge, into the Borg's unknown. Catherine's voice was tight. Elias, this isn't a place. He swallowed. No, it's something worse. She turned to him, fear in her eyes. Then why is the codex leading us here? Monroe exhaled. Because this is where the first ones went. The ones who tried to break free. The ones who failed. Far behind them, the Watcher stood at the shifting edge of the ruined world, its countless eyes fixed upon them. It did not move. It did not need to. Because it knew they were already dead. Because the thing that lived beyond the void was not a savior. It was something else. Something that had been forgotten, even by time itself. And now, it was about to wake up. Monroe took a deep breath. The void was pulling at him. It wasn't just empty space. It was something alive, something sentient. And the codex wanted them to step inside. Catherine gritted her teeth. Tell me we're not doing this. Monroe looked at her. If we stay here, the Watcher takes us. He turned back to the infinite blackness. If we go forward, maybe we find the ones who tried to escape. He stepped forward and fell. The void swallowed him whole. No light, no sound, no time, just falling, falling, falling. He awoke to whispers. Not from the Watcher, not from the Devourer. Something else. Something that had been waiting for him. A figure stood in the endless dark, half seen, half imagined. Not human, not alien, something in between. Something that had once been alive. Monroe's breath caught in his throat, because he recognized it. Not the face, not the form, but the eyes. They were the same as his, and when the figure spoke, it was his own voice. You shouldn't have come here. The figure in the darkness stared at him with his own eyes. Monroe felt something pull at his mind, as if the void itself was reaching inside him, trying to rewrite him, trying to make him understand. His voice, his own voice, spoke again. You shouldn't have come here. Monroe swallowed, gripping the sired codex. Who are you? His voice was hoarse. The figure tilted its head. I was you. A long time ago. The words twisted inside his skull. I was you. Not, I am you. Not, I will be you. I was you. Something cold slithered through his chest. What does that mean? The figure stepped forward, and as it did, the darkness behind it shifted. For the first time, Monroe saw what lay beyond the void, and his mind screamed. This place was not nothingness. It was filled with something, something vast and ancient and infinite, something buried and beyond the cycle, a place where time had been peeled away, where history had been ripped apart and replaced with something worse. The shadows were not empty. They were filled with shapes, endless and shifting, fragments of civilizations that had been erased. Monroe saw them, a city, half dissolved, floating in the dark. A temple, its walls moving like liquid, whispering names that had never been spoken. 1,000 towers, each one filled with the echoes of people who no longer existed. This was where the first one's steer had gone. But they had not escaped. They had been consumed, and they were still here, watching, waiting. There were a figure that was him. Took another step forward. You thought you were the first to reach this place? Monroe's chest tightened. No, he whispered. No, that's not possible. The figure had smiled. And suddenly Monroe and I understood. This was the final secret. The Sir Cycle wasn't just resetting worlds. It was resetting right people. Monroe had been toward here before. Not once, not twice, but again and again and again. Every cycle, he had reached this place, and every time, he had failed. Far beyond the void, something stirred. Something old. Older than the cycle, older than the Devourer, older than history. The thing that had been waiting and beyond all existence. It had noticed him, and now, it was reaching for him. The codex burned in Monroe's grip. The pages were disappearing, not being erased, not being destroyed, being rewritten. Because this was here the moment he had always reached, the moment where he had always failed, the moment where he had to make a choice. The matter thing in the void had whispered, not in words, not in thoughts, but in possibilities. It showed him versions of himself, scattered across cycles, thousands of him, millions, each one reaching this place, each one choosing wrong, each one lost. This is the end. The voice whispered, make your choice. And Monroe knew this was the only chance, the only way to break free. But he had to decide, now, before the void took him, before he mind became nothing. Again. Monroe's mind spun as the weight of aimed infinity pressed down on him. He saw himself, 1,000 versions, 1,000,000 echoes, all standing right where he was now. All of them had Mao chosen, and all of them had Mao failed. The figure that Mao was him took another step forward, its form flickering like a dying star. You don't remember, do you? Monroe clenched his fists. The codex was fading in his hands, its symbols dissolving into the dark. He had to choose, but he didn't even know what the choice was. Catherine's voice pierced the void. Elias? Monroe turned. She was still there, still real. Her breath ragged, her body shaking under the weight of awe in the place that should not exist. She grabbed his arm. Don't listen to it, whatever this is, whatever's happening. You can break it. Monroe stared at her. Could he? Or was she just another echo and another piece of the cycle that was meant to repeat forever? Beyond the void, the Watcher remained still. It had seen this moment before. It had watched Monroe make his choice over and over in every cycle, and every time, Monroe had made the wrong one, because the truth was simple. There was no way to win. There was only acceptance, and that was why the Watcher was not afraid. Not yet. The mouthing beyond the void whispered again, shifting through not realities, offering him glimpses of what could be. A world where he stayed, a world where he became part of it, a world where he ceased to be, or a world where he ran, where he left everything behind, where he escaped. But had anyone ever escaped? Had Monroe ever made it out? Or was that just another illusion? Another lie? Catherine's grip tightened. Elias, choose. The void shuddered. The world around him began to collapse. The final moment had come. This time, would Monroe break the cycle, or would he fall again? The void shuddered. Monroe felt reality collapsing around him, the weight of every past failure pressing against his mind. The figure that was him watched in silence. You've already lost. Monroe gritted his teeth. No. The codex was almost gone, its symbols disintegrating into the blackness. Catherine held his arm tight, her pulse racing against his skin. Elias, choose. But that was the problem. There was no right choice, because every cycle had ended this way. The void, the decision, the failure. He had never won, because he had always tried to choose, and that was the trap. The cycle wasn't about choosing. The cycle was about playing by its rules, and the only way to win was to stop playing. Monroe took a slow breath, and for the first time, he let go of the narcotics, of the fear, of the idea that he could choose at all. He stepped backward, away from the void, away from the choice, and the moment he did, everything shattered. The figure that was him jerked forward, its form glitching, its eyes widening in something Monroe had never seen before. Fear. The void convulsed. The Watcher, the thing that had stood in silence for every cycle before, moved. For the first time, because this had never happened. Monroe had never walked away. He had never had to refuse to choose. He had never either broken the rules. Until now. And now, the cycle was cracking. The void collapsed inward. The Watcher screamed. The figure that was him began to disintegrate, reaching out in desperation. No, no. You can't. But Monroe was already gone. He fell, not into nothingness, not into the cycle, but into something new. Something that had never existed before this moment. Something beyond the Devourer, the cycle, the void, the choice. For the first time in eternity, Monroe was free. Monroe woke to the sound of the waves. His eyes opened slowly, the sky above him, blue. Not crimson, not black, just blue. He sat up. A beach stretched before him, the ocean vast and endless. Beside him, Catherine stirred. She was alive. She looked at him, breathless. Where are we? Monroe exhaled. I don't know. He turned toward the horizon. But I think this is the first world, the one that had existed before the cycle began, before it had all been lost, before everything had been rewritten. And now, they were the only ones here, and the world was theirs to make. Story 2. The Pyramid of the Forgotten God. The desert wind howled like a living thing, carrying whispers from a past, older than time itself. Dr. Adrian Grant adjusted his scarf against the blowing sand, his heart pounding as he stood before the structure that should not exist. It was a pyramid. but not one recorded in any historical text, not one marked on any map. It had no name, no history, no reason to be here. And yet, it was real, and it was calling to him. They had found it by accident. A routine geological survey near the Great Pyramid of Giza had revealed something impossible. Buried beneath the dunes, a vast, underground chamber, untouched for millennia, containing the top of another pyramid. A pyramid that was buried beneath the desert. A structure far and older than the Great Pyramid itself. The discovery had been hushed, classified, hidden from the public. Adrian had been chosen to lead the excavation, and now, as he stood at the entrance, an impossibly large doorway carved with symbols that predated all known Egyptian writing. He felt something stir inside him. A presence. Uttered watching. Something had been sealed away here, and now they were about to wake it up. The excavation team moved cautiously. The pyramid's interiors was different from anything Adrian had ever seen. Not stone, but something else. The walls hummed. Not metaphorically. They were vibrating, as if the entire structure was alive. Dr. Nadia Hassan, an expert in ancient languages, ran her fingers across the carvings. Her expression was unreadable. "This isn't Egyptian." Adrian frowned. "What do you mean?" She swallowed. "This writing, it's older than the oldest hieroglyphs, but it's also wrong." Adrian's stomach twisted. "Wrong how?" She hesitated. "Some of these symbols, I've seen them before." He stared at her. "Where?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Inside the Sphinx." Deep within the pyramid they found the chamber. A vast, circular space, its walls covered in carvings of figures that were not human. And at the center, a black sarcophagus. Unlike any tomb ever discovered, made from a material that defied analysis, smooth, cold. And when Adrian touched it, it whispered, not in words, not in thoughts, but in memories. Images flooded his mind. A civilization that predated the pharaohs. A god that had walked among them. And a warning. One phrase burned into his consciousness. "Do not open it." But it was already too late, because the lid was moving from the wet inside. Far above on the surface the stars shifted. Something ancient had awakened, and the night sky would never be the same. The lid of the black sarcophagus was slid open with an unnatural smoothness, as if it were moving without effort. Adrian once staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. The chamber seemed to tighten around them, the walls pulsing like the interior of a living thing. Dr. Nadia Hassan clutched his arm. "Adrian, we need to—" She never finished, because something inside the sarcophagus moved. The one thing that lay within was not a mummy. It was not human. It was something else. A shape that should not exist, covered in shifting golden inscriptions that crawled right across its dark skin, like living hieroglyphs. Its eyes opened, and the moment they did, the lights in the chamber vanished. Not dimmed, not flickered. Vanished, leaving them in total darkness. And in that silence, Adrian felt it. Voice. Not in his ears, but in his mind. "You should not have come here." Above ground, the sky over Giza changed. The stars rearranged themselves. Tourists on the plateau froze in place, staring upward as an ancient pattern, one unseen for millennia, began to form in the heavens. And in the nearby village, an old man whispered a name no human should remember, because this had happened before. And the last time, Egypt was nearly wiped from history. Adrian gasped as the hard darkness lifted. He was no longer in the pyramid. He was somewhere else. A vast, endless desert, but the sky was wrong. 2 suns burned overhead. And on the horizon, a city built for giants, its towers covered in the same moving inscriptions that had covered the figure in the sarcophagus, a civilization that had been buried, erased, forgotten, and then a voice from behind him. "You have awakened the first god." Adrian turned and saw a figure standing in the sand. It had no face, just golden eyes, watching, waiting. "You cannot stop it now." The air shimmered, thick with heat and something else, something unnatural. Adrian's boots sank into the soft sand, but the sensation was wrong. The ground wasn't solid. It felt as if he were standing on chair A memory, a place that existed between time. The faceless figure and stood before him, its golden eyes unblinking. "You have awakened it." Adrian swallowed, his mind stilled by reeling shot from the transition. A moment ago, he had been in a pyramid beneath Giza. Now, he was standing in a city that did not exist. The towers on the horizon were impossibly large, their black stone surfaces etched with moving hieroglyphs. The symbols writhed like living things, whispering secrets that no human was meant to hear. "What is this place?" Adrian demanded. The figure tilted its head. "It is the first city." A gust of wind swept across the desert, carrying whispers. Adrian could feel them, pressing against his mind. Thousands of voices. Not speaking. Begging. A name surfaced in his thoughts. Not Egyptian, not human. Something older. Ushabtak. The name of the cursed unforgotten god. The thing that had been sealed in beneath Egypt long before the pharaohs ever walked the earth. And now, it was awake. Beneath the sands of Giza, the excavation chamber shook. Dr. Nadia Hassan stumbled backward, eyes wide as sand began pouring into the room from the ceiling. The black sarcophagus was empty. The thing inside was gone. The pyramid was closing. And above ground, the Sphinx cracked. A massive fissure split across its face, revealing something hidden beneath the ancient stone. A second head, a face not human, and its eyes were open, watching, waiting, because the half-forgotten god was returning. And this time, it would not be sealed away. Adrian was staggered. His vision were blurring as the golden-eyed figure stepped forward. "You have been chosen," it said. "Chosen for what?" Adrian demanded. The figure's voice was calm, absolute. "To witness the last cycle." The city trembled around them. From the horizon, something massive stirred. Something that had been buried beneath the dunes of time. And now, it was rising. A shadow stretched across the city, a form so large it blocked the twin suns above. Adrian's heart pounded, because he knew this was Ushabtak. This was the forgotten god. And now it was stepping back into the world. Far above on the surface, the pyramids of Giza trembled. Tourists screamed as the sand boiled and shifted, revealing structures beneath them that had not seen the light of day for thousands of years. An entire second necropolis, hidden beneath Egypt, a temple dedicated to a god erased from history. A temple that was no longer sealed, because it was waking up, and the world would never be the same. The sky darkened as the thing on the horizon moved. It was not a man, not a statue. It was Ushabtak, the forgotten god, and it was rising. Adrian felt his mind fracture as he took in its sheer size, a shape so vast, so impossible, that his brain refused to fully comprehend it. It wasn't walking, it was unfolding. A being that had once walked the earth before humans ever built cities, now returning to a world that had forgotten it. And as its golden eyes turned toward him, Adrian felt something reach inside his mind. Something ancient, something hungry. Above ground, the pyramids of Giza trembled. Dr. Nadia Hassan stumbled backward as the gory sand split open in great chasms, revealing structures buried beneath them. Temples, obelisks, an entire necropolis hidden beneath Egypt. The tourists fled, screaming as the Sphinx cracked apart, revealing a second head beneath its weathered stone, a face not human. And when its eyes opened, the night sky shifted. The constellations moved, because the stars were aligning again, for the first time in 12,000 years. Adrian collapsed to his knees, his skull pounding. The faceless figure stood beside him, watching in silence. Adrian gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "What is it doing?" The figure spoke without emotion. "It is remembering itself." The words sent a cold shock through Adrian's bones. Ushabtak had not been dead. It had been forgotten, sealed away beneath the Mao pyramids. Not a god of the dead, and a god of memory. And now it was rewriting history, making the world remember. Across the planet, strange phenomena erupted. In the British Museum, ancient Egyptian artifacts glowed. With an eerie light, their hieroglyphs rearranging themselves into words that no scholar could translate. In the Vatican archives, an unopened scroll, sealed since the Crusades, burned away, revealing a warning that had been hidden for centuries. And in NASA's Deep Space Observatory, astronomers stared in horror as their star charts changed. Not by movement, but because the sky itself was being rewritten. As if history was correcting a mistake called human civilization. Adrian felt the ground quake beneath him. The city of the forgotten ones, Shokard, was collapsing, its buildings sinking into the sand. Because it had never truly been here. It was a memory. And now, Ushabtak was making room for the new world. Catherine appeared beside him, gasping, stumbling forward. She had been pulled here too. Her voice was panicked. "Adrian, what's happening?" He turned to her, his mind splintering, under the weight of what he now understood. "It's not just waking up," he whispered. Catherine's eyes widened. "Then what is it doing?" Adrian swallowed. "It's replacing everything." Across Egypt, the sky turned gold. The pyramids shifted, realigning. The ancient world was returning. And humanity was being erased. The sky over Egypt burned gold. Not fire, not light. Something older. Something that had been buried in the past, waiting to be remembered. And now, the world was remembering. Adrian gasped as the traitor ground buckled beneath him. The city of the forgotten ones, the first city, was coming apart. Not collapsing, not destroyed. Unraveling, like it had never truly existed. Catherine grabbed his wrist, pulling him back, as massive wide black stone towers dissolved into sand. The man-and faceless figure stood at the edge of the chasm, watching, unmoved, unconcerned, because this was how it was always meant to be. Adrian's pulse pounded. "What's happening?" The figure turned. "It is rewriting history." The words sent ice down his spine. What? The figure's golden eyes burned. This is the world before your kind. The sands swirled, the stars shifted, and for the first time, Adrian saw it, the world, as it was before humanity. Above ground, Nadia Hassan stumbled back as the Great Pyramid split open. And no second structure was emerging from beneath it. Older, darker, not Ixar tomb, Ixar throne. The true pyramid, the one built for Ushabtak, a structure that had been erased from time itself. And now, it was replacing what came after. The world was no longer Egypt. Egypt was no longer Egypt. Because the true empire was returning. Adrian choked down his panic. Tell me how to stop this. The figure studied him. There is no stopping it. Adrian's fists clenched. Then tell me how to survive it. For the first time, the figure smiled, and behind it, the first city crumbled into nothing. Across the world, history was unraveling. In the British Museum, Egyptian artifacts shattered, their carvings twisting into symbols that no modern scholar had ever seen. In Vatican City, the sky turned black over the ancient basilicas as texts hidden for centuries burned away in golden fire. And in Washington, D.C., at the Smithsonian Archives, an ancient map of the Nile, one drawn by Greek scholars thousands of years ago, rewrote itself, showing a Lur civilization that was never supposed to exist. A civilization that predated all human records. A civilization built for gods that walked among men, because they were coming back. Adrian turned to Catherine, breathing hard. We need to leave. Catherine's eyes darted to the dissolving world around them. Leave Khan where? The crone faceless figure answered. There is one place outside time. Adrian instilled. The necropolis. The word surfaced in his mind. Not a city for the dead. A city for those who had refused the god's rule. The only place left. If it still existed. Catherine grabbed his hand. Then we find it. The ground lurched. A shadow loomed over them. Ushabtak had turned its eyes toward them, and the god had remembered them. Above ground, the true pyramid was fully revealed. A massive, black structure, its peak crowned with a gold that burned with unnatural light. The sky split open. And from within, something stepped through. Something that had not walked the earth for 12,000 years. The priest kings of the forgotten god, their empire had returned. And humanity was no longer welcome. The true air thickened, charged with a presence too ancient to name. Adrian felt it pressing against his mind. Not words, not thoughts, but a force, a command, a demand. Submit. The god had turned its eyes upon them, and it had remembered them. The large ground trembled. As the first city collapsed, its towers erasing themselves from existence. The wide, faceless figure San was gone. Catherine pulled Adrian back, her voice sharp. Move! They ran, but behind them, the sky opened. A golden tear split across the heavens, and from within stepped the forgotten ones. In Cairo, the tourists screamed as the pyramids shifted, realigning with constellations that no modern civilization had ever mapped. At the base of the Great Pyramid, Dr. Nadia Hassan fell to her knees as a doorway appeared in the sand. It had not been excavated. It had not been discovered. It had simply always been there. But now it had been remembered. And from within, something stepped out. A figure clad in gold and obsidian, its face hidden behind a mask, older than time itself. A priest of the forgotten god. It turned its head toward the screaming crowds, toward the ruins of the modern world, and it raised its hand. The sky darkened, and the rewriting of history accelerated. Adrian and Catherine reached the edge of the shifting sands. The landscape was changing behind them, erasing roads, buildings, everything human. The god was rewriting the world, and they were running out of time. Catherine gasped, pointing ahead. There, drew a black doorway, standing in the desert, untouched by the golden storm, the entrance to the necropolis. The last city of the traitors, the ones who had opposed the god Eeyore and survived, if only for a little while. Adrian's pulse pounded. This was it. Their only chance. And then, a shadow moved behind them. Something had followed them. Something that did not belong to the god, but had existed long before it. Something watching from the spaces between time, and it had just stepped into the world. Above in the rewritten sky, the stars burned in new patterns. Patterns that had not been seen in 12,000 years. Because now, time belonged to the forgotten god, and all who opposed it would be erased. The more black doorway loomed before them, untouched by the golden storm rewriting the world. The entrance to the necropolis, the last place that had resisted the forgotten god. Adrian felt his mind scream as the forces around him battled, the god reshaping history, the ancient power behind the door pulling him in. Which was worse, to enter the city of traitors, or to be remembered by a god who would never let them go? Behind them, the sky split again. The priest-kings of the Forgotten Empire had seen them, and they were coming. Catherine yanked Adrian's arm. Inside, now. They lunged through the doorway, and the world vanished. Silence, not absence of sound, absence of existence. For a moment, Adrian felt like he had been ripped out of time itself, and then the world returned. But it was not the same. They stood in a dead city. Black stone streets stretched in every direction, lined with crumbling towers that seemed frozen in decay. The air was thick, charged with something unnatural, something ancient. This place had once been grand. It had once defied the god. And now, it was a graveyard. Catherine's breath was shallow. What is this place? Adrian exhaled, scanning the ruins. The necropolis. The ones who opposed Ushaptak. They must have built this. She turned to him, eyes wide. Then where are they? He didn't answer, because he already knew. They were gone. Not dead, not buried, erased. The god had not just killed them, it had removed them from existence, as if they had never been. Far above, something shifted. The sky here was not the same. Not golden like the god's rewritten world, not black like night. It was utter wrong. A sky that did not belong to any world. A watching sky. And Adrian felt it. Something else was here. Not part of the god's empire. Not erased. Something that had waited for them. They moved cautiously through their dead city. The buildings were massive, made for people who had been different. Taller, stronger, something not quite human. The last of the ones who had tried to stop the god and failed. Catherine stopped suddenly. Adrian, she pointed. At the cog center of the necropolis, a structure still stood, Aeon Temple. But not for Ushaptak. The traitors had worshipped something else. something arc older than the god itself, something they believed could shard save them. And Adrian realized it had not been erased. It was still here, waiting. Above, the sky rippled. Something descended. Not the god, not its priests. Something and else. Something that had been watching, waiting for this exact moment. Because Adrian had made a mistake. He had thought the forgotten god was the end. But Ushabtak had been afraid of something. And now, that thing was waking up. The temple Raul loomed before them, untouched by time, its gun-black stone walls humming, with an energy that made Adrian's skin crawl. This place had survived. Not because Ushabtak had spared it, but because Ushabtak had been afraid of it. Catherine hesitated. "Do we go in?" Adrian exhaled, his breath shaking. "We don't have a choice." Behind them, the Birn sky cracked. A very golden light away burned at the edge of the necropolis. The forgotten gods, Jai's priest kings and Gain had found them. And they were coming. They ran into the temple's darkness. And in a moment they crossed the threshold. The doors sealed behind them. The golden light vanished. And they were alone. The air inside was thick, heavy with something unspoken. Not dust, not age. Something alive. Something that had been waiting. Catherine touched the walls, her fingers trailing over symbols carved deep into the black stone. "This writing," her voice was hushed. "It's not Egyptian." Adrian swallowed. "Then what is it?" She turned to him, her face pale. "It's older." They reached the inner chamber, a massive circular hall lined with towering Shin statues. But these were not pharaohs, not gods, not a human. The figures were tall, thin, alien, their elongated skulls crowned with intricate golden headdresses, their hands stretched upward, as if calling to something beyond the sky. And at the center of the chamber, a black monolith, smooth, unmarked, and humming. Adrian felt his body, H just standing near it, his vision blurred. The air warped around the monolith, like space itself was bending. Catherine stepped closer. "What is this?" Adrian wasn't sure. But deep inside, something whispered. And he knew this wasn't built. This was left behind. By something that had been here long before Ushabtak. Far outside, the priest kings stood at the necropolis's edge, their golden eyes narrowed. They did not step forward. They did not enter, because even they knew better. Even they feared what lay inside, because they had not erased this place. They had sealed it, locked it away, because what had been worshipped here was something that should never wake again. Adrian touched the monolith, and the moment he did, the world shattered. Visions. A civilization that was not human, not gods, not worshippers, but rulers. Not from Egypt, not from Earth, but from the white stars. They had walked here once. They had ruled here once. Until when something betrayed them. Until something wiped them out. And now, Adrian saw the final truth. Ushabtak was not the first god. Ushabtak was not a creator. It was a usurper. A god that had risen only because the true rulers had fallen. And this temple, it was not a Geru sanctuary. It was a beacon. The monolith pulsed. The statues trembled. And outside, the sky above Egypt shifted. Because the signal had been sent. and the true gods were returning. The monolith pulsed, a deep, resonating hum that shook the temple walls. Adrian's mind fractured under the weight of the visions. The first gods, not Egyptian, not human, but something else. Something that had ruled Earth before time was counted. Something that had been erased. And now, it was a coming back. Catherine staggered backward. Adrian, what the hell just happened? He tried to speak, but the words were not his. They were something older, something burned into his mind by the monolith. We were never meant to rule. The words tasted wrong in his mouth. Catherine's face paled. What do you mean? He turned toward her, his pulse pounding. Human civilization was never supposed to happen. The temple shook violently. The statues crumbled, their stone faces erasing themselves from time, because the true gods had heard the call. And now, they were rewriting reality. Above the necropolis, the sky split open. Far above the clouds beyond Earth's atmosphere, something moved. Not a comet, not a ship, something vast. Something that had been waiting in the silence between stars. It had ruled before, and now it would rule again. The priest kings of Vatican stood at the temple's sealed doors. They had felt the signal. They had felt the summoning, and they knew what was coming. They did not speak. They did not move, because this was the final moment. Either Ushabtak would hold its stolen throne, or the true gods would return and erase all that came after them. Even the forgotten god would not survive, because Ushabtak had not created this world. It had only stolen it. And now, the first gods wanted it back. In Washington, D.C., at the SETI Deep Space Observatory, alarm screamed, "Sir," a technician's voice trembled. "We've picked up an unknown transmission." General Slade frowned. From where? The technician swallowed. Not from space. Not from deep orbit. She turned, her face pale. The transmission is coming from Egypt. Slade's jaw tightened. What does it say? She hesitated. Then she whispered, "They have heard us." Adrian's breath came in short gasps. He could feel it, the presence, the thing that had ruled before pharaohs, before humanity, before time, and it was watching him. The monolith pulsed, one final time, and then a voice, deep and endless, filled the temple. Not human, not godly, something older than either. "We are returned." Above Earth, the stars shifted. A new constellation burned into the heavens. The same pattern carved into the monolith. The first gods had arrived, and now the world would change forever. The temple trembled, the monolith pulsed, and the air itself vibrated as something beyond understanding reached into reality. Adrian's body seized. His mind split apart, because he could see them now. The first gods. Not myths, not forgotten, just waiting. And now, they had returned. Above Egypt, the sky was wrong. The stars twisted, realigning Bod into patterns no human civilization had ever mapped, because these were not human constellations. They were marks of ownership, a warning to those who would challenge them. The earth trembled, as structures buried for millennia erupted from beneath the sands. Massive temples, black pyramids, obelisks carved with symbols that no archaeologist had ever recorded. The world was being reshaped, not by war, not by destruction, by memory, by the return of the old order. And humanity was no longer part of it. Catherine gripped Adrian's arm, her eyes wild. Adrian, they're here. He could feel their presence, their gaze. They were watching him, judging, deciding, and then a voice, not spoken, but felt. You have broken the silence. The temple darkened. A shadow moved, something had stepped through the monolith, and it was not human. The war priest kings of Ushabtak knelt outside the temple. They did not run. They did not fight, because they understood. Ushabtak was not the first god. It had ruled only because the true masters had been gone, and now they were home, and nothing could stand against them. Not even Ushabtak. In Washington, the SETI observatory went silent. A single message had been received, broadcasted across every frequency, spoken in no human language. And yet, every scientist, every scholar, every person understood it. A message from beyond the stars. A message from the true gods. Their time is over. And with that, the world changed. Adrian fell to his knees. He had awakened them. He had summoned them. And now he had only one question left. Would he be allowed to exist in their world, or would he be erased along with everything else? The answer came swiftly. The first god stepped forward. It raised one elongated hand, and Adrian vanished. Above Earth, the stars continued to shift. A new era had begun, and humanity was no longer part of it, because the true rulers had returned, and they had no need for men. Story 3. The Tomb of the Nameless Pharaoh. The storm howled in across the Egyptian desert, whipping against the tents of the archaeological dig site. Dr. Julian Mercer stood at the edge of a newly uncovered stone entrance, his lantern flickering in the wind. He had spent years searching for this. A tomb with no name, no history, no record in any ancient text. It should not exist. And yet, here it was. The discovery had begun with a single artifact, a dust stone tablet, found buried beneath the ruins of an old kingdom temple. The inscriptions were unlike any Julian had ever seen. Hieroglyphs that defied translation. A name erased from time. And a warning, repeated over and over in broken fragments. Do not disturb his rest. Do not speak his name. Do not wake him. The others had laughed. Cursed tombs, ancient superstitions. Julian had ignored it all, because what he had found was too important. And now, as he stood at the threshold of the forgotten tomb, he felt something stir, deep beneath the sand, as if it had been waiting. They pried open the Vatican stone doorway. The passage beyond was cold, unnaturally so. No murals, no inscriptions, only darkness. The workers hesitated. Julian pressed forward. The burial chamber was unlike anything in Egypt. The walls were in smooth black stone, polished to a mirror sheen. The ceiling stretched too high, curving in ways that felt wrong to the human eye. And at the center, a sarcophagus of solid obsidian. It pulsed, not with light, not with sound, but with something felt in the bones. Something alive. Dr. Nadira Al-Masri, the team's linguist, ran her fingers over the inscriptions on the sarcophagus. Her voice was barely a whisper. This script, it's not Egyptian. Julian frowned. Then what is it? She hesitated. It's older. The air grew heavy. Julian felt something press against his mind. A presence. Watching. He stepped forward and placed his hand on the lid, and the tomb screamed. The Kai sarcophagus screamed. Not a sound, a cloud, vibration. A force that shook the chamber, sending waves of energy rippling through the black stone walls. Julian staggered back, his breath ragged. The air was thick now, pressing against his chest, as if the tomb had just woken up, and it knew they were here. Dr. Nadira Al-Masri's fingers trembled as she traced the inscriptions. "This isn't just a burial site," she whispered. Julian turned to her, heart pounding. "What do you mean?" She swallowed. "This isn't a tomb." Her eyes flicked to the obsidian sarcophagus, still pulsing. "It's a prison." Above ground, the desert storm intensified. The wind carried a low, unnatural hum, vibrating through the air like a distant chant. The locals had already fled the dig site, muttering prayers against old evils. Only Julian's team remained, and beneath them, something shifted in the dark. Waiting. Inside the chamber, Julian's hands shook as he gripped his lantern. "We need to open it," he said. Nadira's head snapped toward him. "Are you insane?" He wasn't sure, but something in his gut told him this sarcophagus held on the last secret of Egypt. Something the pharaohs had erased. Something that had been locked away before history began. And he had to know. They pried at the lid. At first it would not budge. Then, a one deep crack split through the stone, a sound like air rushing into a vacuum. The chamber shuddered, the torches flickered, and then the lid slid open, revealing something impossible. Inside was not a mummy, not bones, not night decay. Inside the sarcophagus, a body lay untouched, skin like black marble, covered in shifting golden symbols, eyes enclosed, breathing, alive. Julian's pulse pounded. Nadira stepped back. This isn't possible," she whispered. But it was, because the nameless pharaoh had not died. He had been waiting, and now they hadn't set him free. Above, the sky turned black. The storm stopped. Not a pause, not a break, aching silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath, because something ancient had returned, and it was looking at them. The nameless pharaoh's eyes snapped open, and the tomb collapsed into darkness. The sarcophagus shattered, not from decay, not from force, but from the sheer presence of the thing inside it. The air vibrated. The black stone walls of the tomb rippled, as if reality itself was warping around the figure that now stood before them. The nameless pharaoh had awakened. Julian couldn't move. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body was unparalyzed, held in place by something unseen, something that commanded obedience. Nadira clutched his arm, her breath ragged. "Julian," she whispered, "what have we done?" The figure stepped forward. Its skin was black as obsidian, its body covered in golden inscriptions that crawled like living hieroglyphs. It was tall, too tall, and its eyes, they burned with a light older than the sun. The nameless pharaoh had not died. He had been sealed. And now the seal was broken. A voice filled the chamber, not spoken, not whispered, felt. "You have made a mistake." The words crashed into Julian's skull, splitting his thoughts apart, like a chisel through stone. He staggered, gripping his head. This was not a rare human voice. It was something else. Something that had once ruled this land, before the pharaohs. Something that had been erased from history, and now it remembered itself. Above ground, The sky turned red. The sun dimmed, as if something massive had passed between Earth and the heavens. In Cairo, lights flickered. Electronic systems failed. And deep within the Vatican archives, a scroll that had been sealed for 1,000 years burned away, revealing a single phrase written in ancient Greek. He walks again. Inside the tomb, Julian fought to breathe. The nameless pharaoh stepped closer, its presence pressing against reality like a weight that did not belong. It raised one golden hand, and Julian felt the air around him bend. Time slowed, memories blurred. For a moment he was standing in two places at once, here in the tomb and somewhere else. A temple that no longer existed, a city that had been buried beneath the sands of time. He saw the priests bowing, he saw an empire trembling, he saw a ritual meant to seal away something too powerful to destroy. And then, a single command, spoken in all language that should not exist. A command that had imprisoned the God King beneath the earth. A command that Julian did not know. And now, he was too late. The pharaoh of the nameless dynasty lifted his hand, and reality ripped apart. The tomb shattered. Not from an earthquake, not from time, but from the will of the being inside it. The nameless pharaoh raised his hand, and the air around Julian bent. It was like standing at the edge of a black hole. Space, time, memory. Everything around him was being peeled away. Julian screamed, not in pain, but in sheer overwhelming terror, because he was falling, not into the sand, not into the chamber, but into the past. The world flashed white. And suddenly, he was no longer in the tomb. He was somewhere else. A city, not ruins, not buried. A living, breathing city, towering structures of black stone, carved with golden hieroglyphs that moved like living things. The air was thick with the scent of incense and blood. And all around him, they bowed. Thousands of figures, prostrating before the same being that had just awakened in the tomb, the nameless pharaoh. Except here, he was not nameless. Here, he was king. Julian's mind fractured under the weight of what he was seeing. This was not a vision, not a dream. This was real. The world before, Egypt as it was recorded, before the pyramids of Giza, before the pharaohs of men. This was the first civilization. And its God King had just returned. The pharaoh's golden eyes turned to Julian, not with rage, not with cruelty, with recognition. Because Julian had not just been pulled into the past, he had been remembered, and that meant he had been here before. Above, the Askis trembled. Twin suns burned in the heavens. Not Earth's sun, not Earth's sky. This was a different time, a different world. And now, it was coming back. The nameless pharaoh stepped forward, and he spoke a single word, a word that should not exist, a word that brought the past back into the present. And across the world, the Askis darkened, the stars shifted, and the history of mankind began to unravel. Because this was not Egypt. This was the world before it, and it had never been meant to be remembered. The air was thick with heat and smoke. Julian staggered forward, his breath ragged. The city around him was impossible, not a ruin, not buried beneath the sands of time. It was alive. Towering black pyramids loomed over vast golden temples, their surfaces pulsing with all-moving hieroglyphs, symbols that shifted and twisted, rewriting themselves in real time. This was not the past, as history knew it. This was something older, something erased, and now it had remembered itself. The nameless pharaoh stood before him. His obsidian skin gleamed, golden inscriptions crawling across his body like living ink. Twin suns burned high above, their light casting eerie, shifting shadows across the alien architecture. This was not ancient Egypt. This was the first empire, a civilization that had ruled before mankind, before time, before the world as it was known. And somehow, Julian was part of it. Catherine's voice cut through the haze. Julian, he turned, and there she was, standing in the middle of a crowd of figures, their faces hidden beneath golden masks. Priests, worshippers. They were bowing, not to the Bayan pharaoh, to him. Julian's stomach twisted. "This isn't real," he whispered. But it was. The nameless pharaoh stepped forward, his golden eyes locked onto Julian's. And then, a single word, a name, Julian's unknown name, spoken in a language he had never learned, a name that had been forgotten, a name that hadn't existed in this world before, a name that did not belong to a man, but to a king. And Julian remembered. His mind tore open. Visions flooded through him. Memories of a life that was not his. A throne. A crown of the black stone and gold. A war against something vast, something beyond the stars. A betrayal, a sealing, a name scratched from time itself. And then a final act, erasing an empire, burying it beneath the shifting sands, hiding it so that no one would ever remember. Until now, Julian collapsed to his knees. His hands shook because he understood this was not a discovery. This was a return, and he was not the first to stand in this place. He had stood here before because he had once ruled here. The nameless pharaoh smiled. "Now you remember, brother." Above, the twin suns dimmed. A shadow stretched across the city. Something was coming. Something that had never truly left. Because Julian had not just unlocked a tomb. He had unsealed a war, and the forgotten gods of the First Empire were about to rise again. The nameless pharaoh stood before him. His golden eyes burned, not with anger, but with recognition. "Now you remember, brother." Julian's breath caught in his throat. Brother, no, that wasn't possible. But the memories crashed into him, relentless as a rising tide. A throne room of our obsidian and gold. A show war that shattered the sky. A show betrayal that sealed them both away. He had not just been here before. He had ruled here. The air thickened, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The city trembled, not with decay, not with destruction, but with resurrection, because this place had not been ruins. It had been waiting, and now it was awakening. Catherine stared at him, eyes wide. "Julian, what's happening?" He could barely breathe. "I don't know." But he did. Deep down, he knew. The First Empire had not been destroyed. It had been buried, hidden from time, sealed away by him. And now, that seal was broken. Above them, the sky shifted. The twin suns dimmed, their light flickering like failing torches. A third sun ignited, but it was not a sun. It was an eye. A vast golden eye, watching from beyond the heavens. The nameless pharaoh tilted his head and smiled. "They have seen us." Across the modern world, reality fractured. In Cairo, the pyramids of Giza cracked open, revealing hidden chambers that had never been recorded. In the British Museum, Artifacts glowed with unnatural light, their inscriptions rewriting themselves before terrified onlookers. In NASA's Deep Space Observatory, every Chandra telescope blacked out, except one that was fixed on a region of space where no stars should be. And yet, a structure had appeared. Massive. Alien, moving, coming. Julian felt his pulse pound. He looked at the mother, nameless pharaoh. He looked at the city rising around him, and he understood. This was not a counter resurrection. This was a counter return. A war was coming. A war he had fought once before, and lost. The nameless pharaoh placed a hand on Julian's shoulder, and for the first time, his voice was soft. It is time to finish what we started. Julian staggered. His mind reeled, because now he had to ask himself the terrifying question. Had he made a mistake sealing away the First Empire? Or had he made a mistake waking it up? The city's walls pulsed with golden light. The sky burned. The First Empire was rising, and the gods that once ruled Earth were returning to reclaim their throne. This was only the beginning. The city pulsed with golden light. The black pyramids burned, their ancient inscriptions reawakening. After millennia of silence, and above it all, the eye in the sky watched, not the sun, not a star, something older, something that had never left. And now it had returned. Julian's hands trembled. His mind reeled. The nameless pharaoh was watching him, waiting for him to accept the truth. That this was not just a lost civilization, not just an ancient kingdom. This was an empire that had ruled the earth before humanity, and he had once been part of it. A king, a traitor, the one who had sealed them away, and now he had broken the seal. Catherine's voice was sharp. Julian, we need to leave, now. Julian barely heard her, because something else had stirred, a second presence. Something even older than the First Empire. Something that had been watching from the void, waiting for the first gods to rise again. Far above Earth, in the sentient, cold silence of space, there were things that should not exist. Moved. A structure beyond understanding. Not a ship, not a planet. A temple adrift in the blackness. And now, it was opening. In Cairo, the pharaoh pyramids of Giza trembled. Other hidden chamber, sealed for over 12,000 years, unlocked itself. Inside, upper statue cracked apart. Not stone, not metal. A guardian left behind by the last war. And now, it was waking up. Because the battle was about to begin again. The nameless pharaoh turned to Julian. He spoke in a language that no human should have understood. And yet, Julian did. The gods are returning. The dog air hummed. The city shifted. And then, from the depths of the rising empire, something crawled out of the darkness. Something that had been left behind. Something that even the first gods had feared. And now, it had been remembered. The sky split open, and the war for Earth began. The sky split apart. The sky above the city widened, burning with golden fire. The black pyramids pulsed, their ancient glyphs rewriting reality itself. And from the depths of the necropolis, something crawled upward. Something even the first gods had feared. Something that should never have been remembered. Julian felt it before he saw it. A presence pressing against his mind, vast and endless, like a hole in the universe itself. His thoughts fractured. Memories of his past life as a king clashed with the modern man he had become. He had Saul sealed away the First Empire. He had Saul locked away their gods. But now, something else had sound slipped through the cracks, and it was all older than them all. Catherine's voice was all distant, distorted. "Julian, do you hear me? We have to go." He turned toward her, but she was already changing. The world was rewriting itself, the past and present colliding, and Julian was at the center of it. Above Earth, this temple in deep space, fully opened, a signal echoed across the void, not light, not sound, but something worse. And something answered. A shape moved in the darkness, not a god, not a king, something that had been watching from beyond time, something that had let the first gods rule. Until now. The nameless pharaoh stepped forward, his golden eyes locked onto Julian's, and for the first time, his voice was quiet. "Choose, brother." Julian froze. His past was screaming. His future was vanishing, and the world was about to end. The Norse ground split apart. Our first gods descended, and the thing that even they feared finally stepped into the world. The last war had once begun, and Julian's choice would decide the fate of everything. The ground split apart. The black pyramids cracked, golden energy unbleeding from their seams. The eye in the sky burned, its gaze turning toward the thing that had stepped through the rift. And Julian? He stood between Raul two impossibilities. The Raul first gods, and the Raul thing from the void. Both of them waiting. For him. The whitey nameless pharaoh spoke first. His voice was calm, absolute. "Brother, you sealed us away once. Do not make the same mistake again." His golden eyes burned with eyes expectation. He was asking for Gabber loyalty, for Julian to stand with him, to restore the First Empire, to erase the world that had come after it, to rewrite history in its true form, to undo humanity's reign. And then, the other voice. The thing that had slipped through the cracks of reality, the thing that even the first gods had feared to name. It did not speak in words. It spoke in kind thoughts, in raw, unfiltered knowledge. Julian's mind had bent under its weight. Memories flooded back. Visions of before the First Empire, before the gods, before in the pyramids, the temples, the stars themselves. Because this thing was older than all of it. It had allowed the first gods to rule. It had allowed the war to happen. And now, it was here to decide the final outcome. "Your choice is an illusion," the voice whispered. "There is only the return to the void." The world trembled. The city of the First Empire was coming apart. The war was not going to be fought with armies. It would be fought with one decision. Julian's decision. Catherine reached for him, desperate. "Julian, don't listen to them. We can stop this. You can stop this." But could he? Was there anything left to unsave? Or had he simply woken up something that should have stayed buried? 1. Stand with the nameless pharaoh. Restore the First Empire and erase humanity's reign, rewriting history into its true form. 2. Side with the void. Let the oldest power consume everything, resetting the universe into pure silence. 3. And reject them both. Fight to preserve the world as it is, even if it means standing against gods. Julian looked up at the burning sky, at the first gods waiting for their empire to rise again, at the cheer thing from the void, waiting to erase all things, and he knew, whatever choice he made, there was no turning back. The fate of the world, of time itself, rested in his hands. And now, he had to choose, not the first gods, not the void. He rejected them both, because this was not their world anymore. This was his world, and if they wanted to take it, they would have to destroy him first. The nameless pharaoh's golden eyes narrowed. Foolish. The thing in the void shuddered, its presence pressing against reality, whispering in his mind. There is no defiance, only the end. Julian's hands shook. He could feel them tearing at him, both forces pulling him apart. The First Empire demanding his loyalty, the void offering oblivion. And yet, he stood his ground, because he had finally remembered the truth. He was never a god, never a ruler, never a king. He had been a prisoner, the last of the ones who had fought back when the first gods ruled, and he had sealed them away, not to save himself, but to save the world. And now, he would do it again. Julian raised his hands, not in surrender, in defiance. And as he did, the city of the First Empire trembled. Not from power, not from war, from a collapse. Because Julian was not just choosing, he was undoing everything. The black pyramids cracked, the sky burned white. The nameless pharaoh's face twisted in fury. You cannot stop what was. But Julian could, because history was not theirs to control anymore. It was his. Though our thing in the void screamed, not in rage, not in fear, but in understanding. It had thought Julian was like the others, that he would fall, that he would choose. But he had done something no one else ever had. He had said no. And that was the one thing it could not comprehend. The city collapsed. The first gods shattered. The eye in the sky closed. And for the first time in 12,000 years, the world was free. Julian woke up to the sound of wind. The sky was blue. The sun was warm. He was lying in the sand, the ruins of the dig site around him. No brass black pyramids, no brass burning constellations, no brass gods. Just Egypt. Just the world as it was meant to be. Catherine knelt beside him, her face pale. "You're alive," she whispered. Julian blinked. "Did we?" She nodded. "It's over." The First Empire was gone. The nameless pharaoh was erased. The void had retreated. And reality had moved on. In Cairo, the pyramids of Giza stood untouched. In the British Museum, the ancient artifacts were silent. And in the deep space observatories, the anomalies in the sky were gone. No gods, no forgotten kings, no impossible civilizations, just history as it was meant to be. Julian exhaled, staring at the sky. "Never again," he whispered. Catherine smiled weakly. Agreed. And together they stood, leaving the ruins, where they belonged. Buried, forgotten, and never to be uncovered again.